Did you know that the food on your plate has traveled thousands of miles before reaching you? From things like bananas to coffee to olive oil to this pineapple to the tea that I'm drinking, these things are all really hard to source locally. This practice of measuring how far your food has traveled to get from the farm to your plate is called food miles. How much do food miles really contribute to the overall carbon footprint of the product? How can you reduce your food miles? To answer this, we need to understand how food miles are calculated and why they matter. Today, we're going to debunk some of the common assumptions around food miles and sustainability. The concept of food miles was created in the late 90s by the UK government, but since then, it's become a widely accepted measure of the environmental impact of food transportation and food distance. It's really important to note, though, that food miles don't account for the emissions of the agricultural practices or food waste. It's only about the distance from the farm to your plate. While processed foods travel an average of around 1,300 miles to get to you, fresh foods actually travel over 1,500 miles to get to you. Today, most modes of transportation still employ fossil fuels, so nearly 1/5 of food systems emissions actually come from food miles. But food transportation is a complex system involving trucks, trains, ships, and planes. Each mode of transportation has a different emissions factor, with air freight being the most intensive or the most polluting. For example, a local tomato traveling 50 miles by car emits 0.034 tons of carbon dioxide. In contrast, a tomato imported from Mexico traveling 2,700 miles emits 1.8 tons of CO2 by truck. If that same tomato is air freighted, the emissions can be as high as 1.1 tons of carbon dioxide per flight. Air transportation produces 32 times more emissions than local transport. Food miles don't account for the emissions of the agricultural practices or food waste. It's only about the distance from the farm to your plate. They're just one component of the total food system emissions. Because of this, we can't make a direct comparison to a lower carbon footprint of a food based on its food miles alone. So this banana might actually have a lower carbon emissions than banana chips produced down the road. We don't know until we start looking at the manufacturing practices and looking at things like emissions factors, which is why we can't make assumptions. Reducing food miles can lower transportation emissions and support local farmers that are implementing sustainable farming practices like regenerative, integrated pest management, or organic practices, even if they're not organic certified. Eating more locally grown produce means eating fresher and more seasonal foods. This also helps your local economies and support your local communities and reduces your carbon footprint based on food miles alone. There are some ways that you can reduce your food miles. The first one being prioritize local and seasonal produce. A best practice that I like to implement when I grocery shop is if you don't know if a food is in season off the top of your head, that's fine. Check the country of origin to help you see where the food is coming from. And if that's on the same continent as you, phenomenal. If it's coming from another country, it doesn't mean that it's bad. It just means that it's coming from further away. If I'm at the grocery store and I see blueberries in February, I'm going to be excited about the berries, but that doesn't mean that blueberries are in season just because they're available. That means that the berries need to come from South America where summer's at peak season. They're going to have to ship here really fast, most likely on an airplane to get here. Another way that you can reduce your carbon footprint based on foods is to opt for minimally processed whole foods over heavily processed items. We're going to get into that a little bit more on this channel, but just know as a basis, the whole foods are typically going to have a lower carbon footprint than a processed food. Now, I'd have to be pretty ignorant to stand here and tell you that locally sourced food is not going to come without barriers to many people. Things like food deserts are a big issue we need to worry about. A food desert is a place where you can't get fresh produce available within a 5-mile radius. If you're in a densely populated area, it's considered about a mile. There's definitely challenges to accessibility and affordability. A lot of food that's produced locally is at smaller scale, which means the input costs are a little bit more expensive. They can definitely be barriers. If you're looking for ways to avoid this, look at purchasing frozen foods. canned foods, preserved foods, they're a great option during the off season. If you really want blueberries in February, that's fine. Opt for the frozen versions. Those are typically harvested locally here. When I say locally, I mean like the same continent. And then quick frozen, made to last all year round. Another thing you can do is support community supported agriculture programs. And I know this can be cost prohibitive, so I definitely want to preface that, but you make a small investment into the farm, and what that does is that helps the farmers cover costs of equipment maintenance, soil amendments, seeds, labor, their staff, packaging containers, all things like that. And then you get to reap the benefits of that investment for like 20 weeks. That produce is supposed to last you for the whole week until you go and you pick up the food again for the next week. So you make that investment up front, and that lasts you for the entire growing season of about 20 weeks. So yes, it's an upfront cost, but you can also look at it as, or you're not going to pay for produce for the next 20 weeks. So it's a trade-off for sure. It's all depending on what works for your budget and what you can afford. If you're curious to learn about seasonal produce and what produce is in season, make sure you check out my seasonal produce guide. I've linked it down below, and that tells you what foods are in season in spring, in winter, in fall, in summer. And then we can even go a little bit deeper if you want, but just let me know if you want a month-to-month breakdown of what that is down in the comments below. But I think it's just really important to know what foods are in your growing cycle. And if you don't know off the top of your head, just a great tip for you is to just check the country of origin. So every small change in your purchasing habits can make a big difference. Some key takeaways I want you to know about food miles are that your food miles are not the only factor in determining whether something is sustainable or not. It is one small fraction of the overall food's carbon footprint, and it's just important to know that food miles are not a one and done. Locally sourced is always going to have a lower carbon footprint in terms of food miles, but that doesn't necessarily mean more sustainable. So make sure you're opting for farms that are implementing more sustainable practices. So just ask your farmers at your local farmers market, how do they grow it? Don't be afraid to ask. They're really proud of what they do. And they're full of so much information. They can give you so many tips and tricks for how you prepare the produce, what's the best way to store it. They know everything. They're so smart. There's some other things just to note about food miles. Like I said, just because it's coming from far away doesn't mean that it's not more sustainable. Things like bananas, have a really low carbon footprint from growing, and then when they're transported here, they're transported in bulk. If you want to learn more about reducing your carbon footprint when it comes to cooking, make sure you follow along for more, and we'll go through these topics. And let me know in the comments below, what did you learn today, and what do you want to know more about? Thanks so much, and I'll see you in the next video.